Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. US President Donald Trump is reportedly planning to announce the withdrawal of about 4,000 troops from Afghanistan. Officials say the drawdown may begin early next week. The withdrawal will leave between 8,000 and 9,000 US troops in Afghanistan. Talks between the US and the Taliban resumed a week ago after they were abruptly called off by President Donald Trump in September. However, Washington paused the talks on Thursday after an attack by the militant group near a key US airbase north of Kabul. Last month, Trump made a surprise visit to the Bagram airbase in Afghanistan to celebrate Thanksgiving with the troops. The US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, soon after the attack on the World Trade Center in New York. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he is disappointed by the results of the climate change summit. In a statement, he called the summit a missed opportunity to tackle the global climate crisis. In Spain, major countries snub calls to combat global warming as the biggest United Nations climate conference wraps up in Madrid. Though delegates from almost 200 countries reached a deal on increasing the global response to curb carbon emissions, the final draft of the conference evades pledges to bolster reductions.
Evidently, it is sad that we haven't been able to reach to a final agreement. We were so close, but I thank you all for your efforts and the long hours and for trying to achieve it.
The issue of carbon markets have been delayed until the next gathering. Delegates agreed to present new, improved carbon-cutting plans by the time of the Glasgow conference next year.
There has been a confrontation of ideas that has not produced a consensus, but has definitely enriched our knowledge and our understanding of Article 6. And we think that bringing this wealth of ideas to the next stage of the discussion will be valuable.
The push for a better deal to curb carbon emissions in the markets was opposed by a range of countries, including the US, Brazil, India, and China. All parties will need to address the gap to prevent global temperatures from rising by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Moving on to India, where 6 people have been killed in violent protests against a controversial citizenship law in Assam. Authorities say 3 people succumbed to their wounds after being shot by police. With the Northeast leading the protest against the contentious law seeking to give nationality to non-Muslim immigrants from 3 neighboring countries, demonstrations have now spread to every nook and corner of India. In Ludhiana, Muslims and Sikhs gathered outside the Jamia Mosque demanding the authorities repeal the law. In Delhi, protests turned violent as protesters set fire to at least 4 railway stations. Train services were suspended in the state of West Bengal. Officials said 6 flights from Guwahati airport were cancelled. Critics say the law is an attempt to marginalize Muslims. The United Nations Human Rights Office has said the law is discriminatory in nature. In Syria, government airstrikes have killed a child and wounded 7 people in northwestern Idlib province. A White Helmet Civil Defense Agency said warplanes hit a bakery in the town of Marsurin. Idlib is the last major rebel-held bastion in Syria after 8 years of war. In 2018, Moscow and Ankara reached a deal to create a de-escalation zone in Idlib. Over 1,300 civilians have been killed in the de-escalation zone since 2018. The Turkish Navy has forced out an Israeli ship in Cypriot waters as tensions continue over natural resource exploration in the region. The Israeli ship was conducting research in the Cyprus's territorial waters in coordination with Cypriot officials. Turkey and Libya signed a deal in November to map out maritime boundary in the east of the Mediterranean Sea. Last week, Greece lodged a complaint to the United Nations over the deal, claiming it threatened regional stability. In Yemen, 9 Houthi rebels have been killed in clashes with the government forces in the northern Marib province. A spokesman for the Yemeni joint forces said 17 rebels were injured in the attack on Ad-Durayhimi district. Yemen has been beset by chaos since 2014 when the Houthi rebels overran much of the country, including the capital. The Saudi-led coalition then launched an offensive in 2015 aimed at rolling back Houthi territorial gains. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin has said Washington's campaign of exerting maximum pressure on Tehran is working. At the Doha Forum in Qatar, Mnuchin said U.S. pressure has drastically reduced Iran's ability to sponsor militants abroad. He said Washington would end all embargoes on Iran if it fulfills the necessary conditions. He added sanctions often work as an alternative to open military conflicts. Talking about Saudi Arabia, he said U.S. troops are stationed in the kingdom on a defensive basis. Mnuchin said the Trump administration is not weaponizing the dollar through its trade restricting policies with other countries. In Lebanon, clashes between security forces and anti-government protesters have left 54 people wounded in central Beirut. Attackers threw stones and firecrackers at security forces who responded by firing tear gas and rubber bullets. State media said 20 police officials were wounded in the clashes and several people fainted due to tear gas shelling. Clashes have become more frequent in recent weeks with Hezbollah and Amal supporters attacking protest camps in several cities. Earlier, Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah claimed the leadership was trying to contain their supporters. Nasrallah said the attackers do not belong to his group. In Hong Kong, clashes between anti-government protesters and riot police broke out in shopping malls across the city. During the peak retail season ahead of Christmas, masked protesters marched through Hong Kong's malls and chanted anti-government slogans. In the Sha Tin area, police fired tear gas outside the New Town Plaza Mall and arrested several people. Police used pepper spray to disperse the demonstrators and made multiple arrests. The city's chief executive, Carrie Lam, is currently in Beijing for an annual visit and is set to meet President Xi Jinping on Monday. U.S. Special Envoy for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, has arrived in South Korea on a 3-day visit. This follows Pyongyang's claim of conducting a crucial test at the Sohae satellite launch site. Biegun will meet South Korean President Moon Jae-in tomorrow amid North Korea's increasing pressure on the U.S. to make concessions to revive denuclearization talks. The U.S. diplomat will head to Tokyo to consult with his Japanese counterpart after his meeting with President Moon. Earlier, Biegun said the U.S.'s stance has not changed regarding the denuclearization of North Korea. Pyongyang has repeatedly warned the U.S. of grave consequences amid the approaching year-end deadline. U.S. Chief Negotiator James DeHart has arrived in Seoul to conduct a fresh round of defense cost-sharing talks with South Korea. DeHart is set to meet his South Korean counterpart Jong Eun-bo for the 5th round of negotiations on Tuesday and Wednesday. Lengthy consultations are expected over the cost of stationing American troops in South Korea. Washington and Seoul have been striving to conclude the deal by the end of this year, when the current one-year accord expires. Washington has demanded a drastic increase in Seoul's payments to cover expenses related to the two allies' combined military exercises. In Nigeria, Boko Haram militants shot dead 19 herders in an attack in northeastern Nagla town. Officials said the militants invaded the village to steal livestock. They said the herders decided to resist but were subdued by heavily armed attackers. The decade-long ethno-religious violence has now spilled over into neighboring Chad, Niger, and Cameroon. It has claimed lives of around 27,000 people and forced over 2 million people to flee their homes. 4 people have died after a 6.9 magnitude earthquake struck the island of Mindanao in the southern Philippines. Local officials said 14 were injured in the disaster. PhilVolc's director Renato Solidum said the quake was tectonic in origin and has so far triggered 90 aftershocks. The local mayor said rescue operations were temporarily stopped due to the aftershocks. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center said there was no tsunami threat from the quake. Several market vendors were also pinned under a collapsed wall in Pedada town. Roads and buildings are damaged, while power transmission systems have also been affected. Tensions between the French government and the unions opposed to pension reforms have mounted as transport strike entered its 11th day. Strike organizers have announced a massive protest on Tuesday. Unions plan to repeat 1995's three-week-long public transport strike that forced the government to back down from pension reform. France's CFDT union has opposed transport strikes over the Christmas period and called for the new measures in January. In contrast, the hardline CGT union said there would be no Christmas break unless the government drops the whole pension reform plan. The pension plan, unveiled by Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, has proposed a single points-based pension system. More stories to follow right after a short break. Welcome back. Queen Elizabeth will set out Prime Minister Boris Johnson's legislative agenda on December the 18th following his election victory. The Prime Minister's office said the agenda will include a pledge to bring back the Brexit bill back to the Parliament before Christmas. The statement said the Queen will also announce the restoration of Northern Ireland's government after nearly 3-year hiatus. The Queen's speech in the House of Lords is used to detail all the bills the government plans to enact over the coming year. Thursday's speech to the Parliament will be the monarch's second in as many months. The Queen delivered one on 14th of October, shortly before the polls, following a deadlock over the government's Brexit plans. Earlier, Johnson said his top priority is to finally secure Brexit after leading Tories to their biggest win in general elections since 1987. Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn has apologised over the party's defeat in Thursday's election. Labour suffered its worst election result since 1935 and saw its vote share fall by 8 points. In an article, Corbyn expressed regret to his supporters, calling it a shock for everyone who wanted real change in the country. Corbyn said he takes the responsibility for the result and will remove himself from the leadership of the Labour Party soon. Meanwhile, in an interview, Labour's finance policy chief John McDonnell said he owns this disaster. He said the new Labour leadership will be in place early next year. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has said Scotland cannot be imprisoned in the United Kingdom against its will by London. In a televised interview, Sturgeon said London would be mistaken to reject a referendum to try and put the matter to rest. The Scottish National Party leader wants to hold a new referendum on independence next year under the mandate of SNP's electoral success. The Scottish National Party won 48 of Scotland's 59 seats in the UK Parliament. New Zealand has confirmed 15 deaths from the volcano eruption in its White Island. The police said 2 people are still missing. The police said the rescue team returned to White Island earlier on Sunday morning to search for the 2 missing people. They searched the area around the piers but reported no new findings as yet. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern said New Zealand will observe 1-minute silence nationwide on Monday in honor of the victims. The volcano erupted last week on Monday on the White Island in the eastern bay of New Zealand's North Island. In Australia, bushfires are blazing out of control on opposite sides of the continent, threatening homes in Sydney and Perth. Heatwave conditions and strong winds continue to fan flames in the Blue Mountains. Emergency warnings for dangerous bushfires are still in effect on both sides of Australia. State media said several properties are destroyed near Mount Toma in New South Wales. In Western Australia, about 400 firefighters are fighting a bushfire north of Perth on the 5th consecutive day. Currently engulfing over 11,000 hectares of land, bushfires have killed at least 4 people across the east coast of Australia since November. In Italy, over 50,000 people have been evacuated from southern Brindisi city as experts work to defuse a World War II bomb. Authorities said it is the biggest peacetime evacuation in Italy. More than 60% of the city's residents have been forced to vacate a red zone. The city's airport, a train station, 2 hospitals and a prison were also shut down. The 1-meter-long British bomb carrying 40 kilograms of dynamite is believed to have been dropped in the city in 1941. The bomb was found last month during refurbishment at a cinema theater. 50 bodies have been unearthed from a mass grave at a farm outside Mexico's western Guadalajara city. The local prosecutor's office said 13 bodies have been identified and the remains are being handed over to their families. The authorities said the site was discovered just over 3 weeks ago in Jalisco, a state hard hit by violence linked to organized crime. Officials said the investigation to identify the remaining victims and their cause of the death will continue. A mass grave with 34 bodies was discovered in Guadalajara in September, while another was found in May with the remains of 30 people. The prosecutor's office said nearly 2,500 murders have been reported between January and November. Bolivia's interim president, Janine Áñez, says former President Evo Morales will be arrested when he returns to the country. The announcement comes 3 days after Morales was granted refugee status in Argentina. Interim leader Áñez said that an arrest warrant for Morales will be issued in the coming days.
Nevertheless, if he wants to return to Bolivia, he knows he has to give answers to the country and he has accounts pending with the justice system. So, he will have to face the consequences. Very likely, in the coming days, the arrest order will be issued because we have already filed the complaint.
It's been 7 years since the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. The massacre resulted in the deaths of 20 children, mostly first graders and 6 adults. Since then, America's gun violence problem has only gotten worse. More in this report.
After Sandy Hook, the American government and people had vowed no such incident would be allowed to happen ever again. Former US President Barack Obama even described 14th December as the worst day of his presidency.
They had their entire lives ahead of them. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, kids of their own. Among the fallen were also teachers, men and women who devoted their lives to helping our children fulfill their dreams. So our hearts are broken today.
However, by 2018, over 400 more people had been shot in 200 school shootings across the US. Rather than uniting the country against gun violence, the Sandy Hook shooting just became another issue dividing Americans.
I think if anything were to happen here today, these people who are against guns would be very happy to have somebody with a gun to protect them.
The pro-gun lobby in the US argues that the right to own a firearm is a basic civil right. This faction also advocates the militarization of schools to make them safer, with armed guards at the doors and gun-toting teachers in the classrooms. There have been 409 mass shootings in the US this year.
Jamaica's Toni Ann Singh has been crowned Miss World 2019. Singh says she wants to use her title to work for sustainable change for women and their children. More about the beauty pageant finale in this report.
The 69th edition of the Miss World Beauty pageant wrapped up in London, where Miss Jamaica Toni Ann Singh of Jamaica was announced as the winner. Singh was crowned by the last year's winner Vanessa Ponce de Leon of Mexico. Singh, a 23-year-old graduate of Florida State University, says beauty is the least important aspect of her win.
I want to make a change that's sustainable. So if we're talking women, if we're talking women, it needs to be something that will make sure that their children and their children's children have a different value of life.
Jamaicans attending the event hailed Singh's coronation as a triumph for their Caribbean island nation.
It's very important. Firstly, Miss Universe was won by a black lady this year. The fact that Miss World is also won by a black person is very, very significant to us because it represents a lot in terms of our culture, in terms of how far the world has moved on. So, Jamaica to the world.
Miss India Suman Rao came in 3rd place, while France's Offly Mazzino was a runner-up.
I am very, very proud to be French and to represent the overseas regions of France because I represent Guadeloupe and Réunion, and I am going to continue my fight for the deaf and the hard of hearing.
This is the 4th time that a representative from Jamaica is crowned as Miss World since 1959.
More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned with Indus News. China has suspended tariffs planned to be implemented on some U.S. goods today. Beijing's State Council Customs Tariff Commission announced the annulment on its website. The decision follows a Phase 1 trade deal between Beijing and Washington on Friday. It reduces some U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods in exchange for higher purchases of American agricultural products. China's retaliatory tariffs were meant to target goods ranging from corn and wheat to U.S.-made vehicles and automotive parts. Washington said Beijing has agreed to import U.S. goods and services worth $200 billion over the next 2 years. It added the U.S. would still impose 25% tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods. Argentina's new government has raised export levies on agricultural products in order to prevent defaulting on sovereign debt. President Alberto Fernandez increased the rate for soybeans, soy oil, soy meal, corn and wheat by 5%. The official decree also raised beef export taxes to 9% from 7%. Buenos Aires is facing restructuring talks with its lenders on about $100 billion in debt. The farmers have been hit hard by the high financing costs, inflation and unfavorable weather. The country faces an annual inflation running above 50% and poverty approaching 40% amid recession. Pakistan has opened its Gwadar port for exports as a vessel loaded with 3 containers of seafood left for Far Eastern ports. Advisor to Prime Minister for Trade and Industries Abdul Razak Daud said Gwadar would reduce the burden on Karachi's Bin Qasim port. Daud said the first vessel carried 3 containers worth $50,000 each. The port is a deep-sea port on the Arabian Sea in Balochistan. It is an important part of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and is a key link in Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. Time to take a look at the weather situation from around the globe. And that's all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus Special.